Greetings, fellow classmates. My name is Eric Cox, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about broadband and home networks. Brought to you from the text, and today's chapter was presented by John J. Labarty, PhD. If you go to the first slide, it's a quote I think we all can relate to. Anyone who has lost track of time when using a computer knows the propensity to dream, the urge to make dreams come true, and the tendency to miss lunch. And that's by Tim Berners-Lee, credited with creating the World Wide Web and probably given us all a reason to dream and probably a lot of reason to miss some time at work and some lunch. So take us to the next slide. We'll talk first about broadband and then we'll move into the home networks. Broadband is a term that's used to describe basically high-speed internet, but understand when we say high speed, that's going to vary from country to country. I was surprised to find that U.S. is not the highest speed of all internets in the nation or in the world, excuse me. But in the U.S., what we consider high speed or broadband is anything with a speed greater than or equal to 4 megabits per second download and 1 megabits per second upload. Next slide. Increased speed or broadband allows users to engage in bandwidth-intensive activities like voice over internet phone, internet video, and gaming. It was impossible to conceive of the kind of internet or broadband-intensive activities like we do or home networking that we do today over something like an AOL or a dial-up connection that we had 20 years ago. So we can thank broadband for that. Next slide. As we get into the background of it, I'm going to go over the different types of the different types of broadband networks that there are. I won't get too deep into the technical aspects of each one. If you want, the text dives a little bit deeper into the technical aspects of those, but I'll just give you a quick overview of what the different ones are. And so the very first one is probably the one where most of us are familiar with, and that's the digital subscriber line, or DSL. That provides broadband access over regular telephone lines with service provided by your local carrier. Now, most common is an asymmetrical DSL line, and that just means that your download speeds are faster than your upload speeds. Then there's fiber to the node, or FTTN. That's a hybrid DSL or VDSL, and that's going to be like your Fios or UVerse from AT&T. And the draw to that is that your speeds are a little bit faster with 50 megabits per second downstream or 20 megabits per second upstream, quite common. And this utilizes fiber optics. If you go to the next slide, we also have fiber to the home, and that's a fiber optic cable all the way to the house. That's an extremely fast connection, 1 gigabytes per second. That's the backbone of cable and telecommunications network, but it's a little less common in most residential settings. They're experimenting with that in certain neighborhoods now, the text talks about, but you're not seeing that quite as common. You'll probably see that more in the future because of the speed and the quality that it offers. You also see cable modems, cable internet, basically using the same hardware that's used to deliver your cable television and in some cases telephone. Next slide. You have satellite internet, and that's for folks who are not in the range of DSL. That's going to be your modem is connected to a satellite dish. The limitation to that being obviously that you're subject to the same problems that you would have with a satellite dish, like weather and connectivity issues. The advantage being that you're not subject to the same limitations that a DSL is, which is you have to be close to other connections. And then you have wireless broadband networks like your mobile and your fixed. Mobile being your telephone networks, your 3G and your 4G offered by your service providers for your cellular networks, and then fixed, your Wi-Fi or WiMAX. Think of your internet hotspots. Next slide. Now that we understand a little bit more about broadband, I want to talk a little bit about home networks. Broadband obviously being the enabler to home networking, which once was a more of a foreign concept for most of us in our homes. Once upon a time, you really only found networking in corporations, government offices, large complex type operations, and that's because it required complex equipment and setup. You needed a server, you needed a hub, you needed a router, and you probably needed a pretty knowledgeable IT guy to run it all and set it up. Next slide. There are several factors that led to that becoming more common and accessible in the home. The first being the broadband internet that we talked about, the speeds available. Second thing being multiple computer households, most of us having more than one computer in our house, making that more necessary to be able to have a router and a network. Then we had networked devices, and then finally affordable routers that could be easily set up and installed. Next slide. Two different types of home networks are the wired and the wireless. Under the wired, going to be the things we're most of us familiar with, the Ethernet, right over your phone lines, and believe it or not, your power lines are a technology that have been used and looked into in the past, not very common because they haven't worked very well. And then your wireless are going to be your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth, and Zigbee enabled devices. If you move to the next slide. One major concern, though, for home networks, particularly for your wireless devices, is going to be security. Wi-Fi uses two types of security. The first is wired equivalent privacy, and that's WEP. The problem with that is it's easily hacked. So there's Wi-Fi protected access, WPA. That one's a little bit better because it fixes these flaws and uses 128-bit encryption. So WPA is a little bit better security for Wi-Fi. If you go to the next slide, the residential gateway that allows all this to happen is the broadband router. This takes the broadband connection and allows numerous network devices to be used at the same time. Your current iteration or experience with this that you're probably picturing in your head is going to be your smart TV that you're allowed to, you're allowing yourself to watch Netflix on, your DVD players that are Wi-Fi enabled, your numerous computers and your laptops, tablets, phones, all of those kind of things that are networked in your house. But what is ultimately envisioned when we talk about a home network, they start talking about the concepts of smart homes, where not just your consumer electronics, but your washing machines, your utilities, your security system, your sprinkler system are all tied into this wireless network, where ultimately you could monitor and control your entire home system and therefore more efficiently monitor your resources and have all of that on one network. If we go on to the next slide. Now that we've talked a little bit about the broadband itself and what that enables us to do and how that kind of ties into the home network, I'd like to talk about some unique considerations of broadband, first being the National Broadband Plan, and then we'll talk a little bit about net neutrality, and then we'll get to the questions for the week. The first is the National Broadband Plan, and that's 16 March 2010, the Federal Communications Commission unveiled a National Broadband Plan, and the purpose of this, as quoted in the book, was to create a high-performance America, a more productive, creative, efficient America in which affordable broadband is available everywhere, and everyone has the means and the skills to use valuable broadband applications. So it's a pretty ambitious goal. Essentially, it was to ensure every American has access to broadband. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see there were 6 stated goals to the National Broadband Plan. And they talk about them in your book, and you can look there for the full laid out goals. For the purpose of this lesson, I kind of summarized them to make them a little bit more succinct, but here they are in the slides. So goal 1 was that at least 100 million homes with affordable access to download speeds of 100 megabits per second upload speed and a 50 megabyte per second download speed. Goal 2 was that the U.S. should lead the world in mobile innovation with fastest and most extensive wireless networks of any nation. Give you a hint, currently we do not. Goal 3 was that every American should have affordable access to robust broadband. Goal 4 is that every community should have affordable access to at least 1 gigabyte per second for institutions that anchor their community. That's going to be like schools, hospitals, libraries, etc. Goal 5 is that first responders should have access to nationwide public safety wireless network. And goal 6, to ensure that America leads in clean energy economy, Americans should be able to use broadband to track and manage their energy consumption. So that goes back to that smart home concept that we talked about, where you could monitor your consumption. They found that when you can monitor your consumption, you're going to be smarter in the resources that you're using, which makes sense. But as you can see in these goals, they range from very, very specific, like download speeds of a certain amount and upload speeds of a certain amount, to very, very general, like affordable access to robust broadband. Well, what is affordable and what is robust? Well, that's going to depend how you define those things. So those are the 6 goals that were laid out in the National Broadband Plan. So that's the National Broadband Plan, and it's obviously still in the works. Congress hasn't made quite the inroads that they had expected to. I'm not sure how you define the success on that, but it is an ambitious plan that has been set out, and it's a goal that they've set out. And we'll get more into that when we pose the questions for the week. But as you can see with the National Broadband Plan, this lays out a vision of broadband as a resource versus a product to be offered. I'm sure that the broadband providers would look at it a little bit differently. Let's move on to the next slide. That brings us to the topic of net neutrality. Now, net neutrality is a topic of hot debate that's continuing to go on. And if you look at the current status of net neutrality, this is how we kind of look at it in the current market. And the current market is that service providers can block or prioritize access to content. So if I pay more money, I can have my content prioritized. Or if a content provider doesn't like what I have to offer, they can kind of steer consumers away. And the Obama administration and the Federal Communications Commission and certain others see this as a free speech issue, and they want to preserve net neutrality. So they support a net neutrality kind of push. But supporters of the current status see this as a free market issue. They feel like if we're providing a product and a service, then we can do whatever we want with that service. And they feel like the status quo is how it should be. And then if we enforce net neutrality, then that stifles the free market and investment. So that's where we stand on net neutrality. If you look at the next slide, in 2010, in April of 2010, the courts ruled that the Federal Communication Commission had only limited power under current law over any web traffic, that there was not much they could do about it. But the Federal Communication Commission continues to attack the issue, fearing that the current status allows large broadband providers like Verizon and Comcast too much control over content and access. So now that we understand that and we've looked at that, it brings us to this week's questions. Yes, I do say questions. Now, you're under no obligation to answer both questions. I found both interesting for discussion as I went through the chapters this week, and so I posted both. Feel free to pick one or both if you want for the discussion. I look forward to your responses. The first one deals with broadband itself and kind of the National Broadband Plan as laid out by Congress, and that was, is broadband a resource or a product? As you can see from the National Broadband Plan, they kind of look at it like a resource that every American should have access to. But if you're a provider, maybe you look at it like a product. And so can the government mandate access, or is it up to a free market to determine access and cost? So that's my first question. So if you should choose to answer that one, then I look forward to the response for that. If you choose to answer the second one, then that's a net neutrality question. And that question is the issue of net neutrality one of free speech or free market? Can the government mandate what access and at what level is given to their service? Or should companies be free to restrict access as they choose and allow competition to determine the access and content? So that's my question, my second question for the week. That's my presentation on broadband and home networking. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to the responses this week, as I always look forward to the discussion. Thank you guys. Have a great week.